All right, hey everyone, welcome back. We are diving deep today into something that should be especially useful for you, UPSC aspirants.
It's a big one.
Yeah, a concept that you'll see popping up across your whole syllabus, from ethics to international relations to historical movements. We're talking about pacifism.
And it's a pretty fascinating counterpoint to the just war theory that we explored last time.
Yeah, it's like having an extra lens to view conflict through.
Exactly. And that can be a real game changer, especially in those essay questions. You got to have multiple perspectives.
Absolutely. It's like another tool in your UPSC toolkit, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to help us unpack this whole concept, we're going to be dissecting an academic text that really throws pacifism right into the ring with just war theory.
Head to head.
But before we get into all that, maybe we should start with the basics. What is pacifism really all about?
Well, in a nutshell, pacifism is the belief that war is always morally wrong. Always. No matter what the circumstances, no matter the justification, pacifists hold that war is never the answer. It's a complete rejection of violence as a legitimate way to resolve conflict.
Okay, so it's like the polar opposite of just war theory,
Yeah.
which tries to figure out when war is okay.
Right. Like, what are the conditions that would make it morally justifiable?
Exactly. So what are the main arguments that pacifists use to support this idea of completely rejecting war?
Well, there are two main lines of thought that are often kind of intertwined. One focuses on what's called the sanctity of life.
Okay.
This is the idea that killing is inherently wrong. So war, by its very nature, where killing is inevitable, is morally unacceptable.
So it goes beyond just avoiding violence. It's like this deeper reverence for all life.
Exactly. And this perspective often stems from religious convictions.
Oh, interesting. Do you have any examples of that, across different religions? I feel like that would be really useful for the exam.
Oh, absolutely. Within Christianity, for example, many Quakers and Plymouth Brethren hold pacifist views. In Hinduism, you have Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence. And of course, in Buddhism and Jainism, pacifism is a very deeply rooted principle.
So it's like this recognition that taking a life, any life, is just fundamentally against their spiritual beliefs.
Right. And it makes you think, does pursuing a higher purpose, like spiritual enlightenment, lead people to reject war altogether?
That's fascinating. So this conviction about the wrongness of killing, that also manifests in things like conscientious objection, right?
Absolutely. It shows how pacifism isn't just theoretical. It translates to real-world actions and choices.
Yeah, like people refusing to join the military because of their beliefs. Okay, so that's one line of argument. What about the second one you mentioned?
So the second argument, sometimes called contingent pacifism, focuses more on the long-term consequences of violence. It argues that violence breeds violence. It creates this vicious cycle that ultimately harms everyone involved and society as a whole. So even if you think you're achieving something good through war, the argument is that the long-term repercussions will outweigh any short-term gains.
So it's not just about the act of killing itself, but about the ripple effects, the way it kind of poisons the well,
Yeah.
so to speak. Are there historical examples of this in action?
Oh, definitely. I mean, look at Gandhi's nonviolent movement for Indian independence.
Right.
His whole philosophy of satyagraha, resisting injustice peacefully, was incredibly effective against British rule. And of course, there's Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil rights activism in the U.S. in the 1960s. Both of these movements show how nonviolent resistance can actually achieve profound social change.
Yeah, they weren't just about winning a political battle. They were about changing hearts and minds. It's pretty remarkable to think about how an idea like pacifism, which can sometimes seem idealistic or even naive, can actually have a real impact on the world.
It's powerful stuff.
But how does this philosophy, which is so often about individual conscience and action, translate to the global stage? How does it influence the relationships between nations, international politics?
Well, pacifism has actually been a really significant force in shaping international politics.
Really?
Oh, yeah. For one, it contributed to the creation of institutions like the League of Nations and later the United Nations. These were organizations driven by the idea of what's called legal pacifism. They aimed to resolve international disputes peacefully through cooperation, dialogue, and a framework of international law.
So it's about moving away from might makes right and towards a system where, like, talking and diplomacy are the primary tools for conflict resolution.
Exactly. And this is why a lot of pacifists actually support really strong global governing bodies.
Interesting.
Even ideas like a world federation or a world government, right? They envision a future where global cooperation and peace actually trump national interests.
It's like this vision that connects peace with broader ideas of social and political justice. It's about tackling the root causes of conflict, rather than just avoiding fights, like that whole positive peace concept.
Exactly. Addressing the underlying issues.
Now, wasn't pacifism also a major driving force behind the peace movement, especially in the 20th century?
Absolutely. Pacifism was really crucial in fueling that global peace movement, particularly after the world entered the nuclear age.
Right.
Groups like the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, C&D in the UK, and the European Nuclear Disarmament, END, they emerged because people realized that nuclear weapons had fundamentally changed warfare.
Yeah, the stakes were so much higher.
Exactly. The potential human cost was just unthinkable.
That fear of total annihilation really pushed the peace movement forward, didn't it? Especially after things like the Cuban Missile Crisis.
For sure.
And this movement's still going strong today, right? I mean, think of the massive anti-war protests against the Iraq War. It shows that those pacifist ideals are still very much alive in modern politics.
Absolutely. And while not all anti-war protests are explicitly pacifist, they often tap into those same principles, the rejection of violence and the belief that war isn't the solution. And these movements have made a real difference. They've put pressure on governments, made it harder for them to justify going to war or staying in a war.
So even though pacifism is sometimes seen as this kind of naive or overly idealistic approach, it's clearly had a pretty profound impact on history, both on a national and an international level. But I imagine there are counter-arguments, right? People who criticize pacifism.
Oh, absolutely. Pacifism has always had its share of critics. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not all sunshine and roses, right? One major criticism is that pacifists are basically free riders.
Free riders.
Yeah, like they benefit from the security provided by those who are willing to fight but refuse to share the burden of defense themselves.
Ah, I see.
So the critics argue that it's unfair. Some people are taking on the risks while others are claiming this moral high ground and reaping the benefits without actually contributing to the system that protects them.
It's like that whole
Yeah.
tragedy of the commons thing, right?
Exactly.
Where people acting in their self-interest end up depleting a shared resource.
Yeah, and in this case, the shared resource is security. And pacifists are accused of depleting it by not doing their part.
It's a tough one to grapple with, for sure.
Definitely. Another critique, and this gets a little more philosophical, argues that pacifism can actually contradict itself.
Oh. How so?
Well, pacifism is often based on this fundamental right to life, right?
Right?
But sometimes defending that right requires using force.
Interesting.
Like imagine you're trying to protect someone from an attacker. You might have to use force, even deadly force, to stop them.
It's that whole self-defense dilemma.
Exactly.
If someone's trying to hurt you or someone else, is it really wrong to use force, even if it means taking a life? It's such a gray area.
It is. And that brings up another tricky question.
Which is?
Is avoiding killing always the most important moral consideration, even if it means sacrificing other values like freedom or justice?
Ooh, okay, now we're getting into the really heavy stuff.
Right. So if a tyrannical regime is oppressing its people, would a pacifist be against any kind of intervention, even if it meant using force to liberate them?
That's a tough one. I'm really curious about how these questions play out in actual real-world conflicts.
Well, that very question has divided ethical thinkers for centuries.
I bet.
Some argue that there are situations where protecting innocent lives and upholding values like freedom and justice actually outweighs the rule against killing, and this is often used to justify what are called humanitarian wars.
Oh, right. Like interventions that are meant to stop genocide or human rights abuses or things like that.
Exactly.
It makes sense in theory, but it also kind of opens up a whole can of worms, doesn't it? About when it's okay for countries to get involved in other countries' affairs, what their real motives are.
Oh, for sure. It gets really murky really fast.
Are there any specific conflicts that are often used as examples in this whole debate about humanitarian intervention and the limits of pacifism?
The Afghan War, especially the U.S.-led intervention in 2001, is a perfect case study. It's complex, there are arguments on all sides, and it's particularly relevant for the UPSC.
Oh, for sure. The Afghan War is definitely a hot topic for the exam. Just to make sure everyone's on the same page, can you give us a quick recap of the context?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Afghan War began in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The U.S. and its NATO allies launched a military operation to overthrow the Taliban regime, who were harboring al-Qaeda.
So the U.S. was acting in self-defense after being attacked, and they had a clear goal, which was to remove the Taliban from power.
Exactly. And from a just war perspective, there were several arguments in favor of the intervention. You had the self-defense argument, the goal was clear, and they had support from NATO and other countries. It seemed pretty straightforward at the time.
But I'm guessing things are rarely that simple,
Yeah.
right? There was a lot of controversy around the war, wasn't there?
Oh, absolutely. Critics raised a lot of concerns about whether the war was really justified and what the long-term consequences would be.
Like what?
Well, for one, some argued that the U.S. had other motives besides just fighting terrorism.
Okay.
Maybe they were trying to, boost their global power or gain control over resources in the region. It wasn't all about altruism, right?
So the question becomes, was it truly about self-defense, or was that just a convenient excuse for other geopolitical goals?
Right, and it gets you thinking about all the hidden agendas and the power dynamics at play.
Absolutely.
Another point of contention was that the Afghan War, unlike the 1991 Gulf War, didn't have explicit authorization from the UN Security Council.
So there were questions about its legality under international law?
Exactly. And then there was the debate about whether the war would actually be effective in achieving its stated goals,
Yeah.
Like, would it actually stop terrorism and bring stability to Afghanistan?
Or would it just backfire and create more problems in the long run?
Exactly. A lot of people felt that military intervention would just further radicalize the region and ultimately make things worse.
Yeah. Those are always the big fears with these kinds of interventions.
Yeah.
And weren't there also ethical concerns about how the war was being conducted?
Absolutely. I mean, the treatment of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay was a huge controversy.
Right.
And then there's the whole issue of civilian casualties, which are always a tragic consequence of war.
Right. Those are unavoidable, unfortunately.
Yeah. The U.S. was accused of violating rules of warfare in their treatment of detainees at Guantanamo with allegations of torture and indefinite detention.
Yeah. I remember those stories.
And the civilian casualty issue was a constant source of tension. Airstrikes and military operations often resulted in the deaths of Afghan civilians, and that raised huge ethical questions about, using proportionate force and protecting non-combatants.
It sounds like the Afghan War, even though it was initially presented as this clear-cut case of just war, was actually riddled with all these complexities and ethical dilemmas.
It really was, and it highlights the challenges of trying to apply these abstract concepts to the messiness of real-world situations.
Absolutely. It makes you realize there's no easy answer, no black and white. It's all shades of gray.
Exactly. And to fully grasp the conflict, it's really crucial to consider the perspectives of all the different actors involved, not just the U.S. and its allies.
So what about the perspective of the Taliban and al-Qaeda? How do they view their involvement in the war?
Well, for them, it wasn't about self-defense or national interests or any of that. They saw it as a jihad, a holy war to defend Islam from what they saw as invaders and to purify their land from what they perceived as corrupting influences.
So their motives and their goals were completely different.
Exactly. It was a totally different framework.
Wow, that really adds another layer to the whole thing. It's a reminder that the same conflict can be viewed in radically different ways by the different parties involved.
Absolutely. And understanding those different perspectives is crucial, especially for, those of you preparing for the UPSC.
Right. It's that nuanced analysis that'll really help you ace those exams.
Exactly. The Afghan War is a prime example of how seemingly straightforward concepts like just war and self-defense can become incredibly complex in practice. It forces you to think critically about the different perspectives, the motivations, the consequences, and the unintended outcomes.
It sounds like the Afghan War really throws a wrench into any simple understanding of pacifism. It pushes us to grapple with those gray areas, those messy situations where it's not always clear what the right course of action is.
It definitely does, and it's that very complexity that's what makes it so important to really delve into these concepts, to dissect them, to challenge your own assumptions. And for you UPSC aspirants out there, this is gold.
Yeah, it's a real-world test case for all those theories we've been discussing.
Yeah.
And it really shows how tricky it can be to apply them in real life, right?
Absolutely. It's not just an academic exercise, it's about grappling with real-world dilemmas. And for you UPSC aspirants, this is the kind of analysis that you'll need to master.
Exactly. The exam isn't just about spitting back facts. It's about showing that you can think for yourself, that you can analyze complex situations.
Right. You need to show that you can see things from multiple perspectives, weigh different arguments, and then come up with your own well-reasoned conclusions. And the Afghan War provides a perfect framework for doing that.
It's a case study straight out of the UPSC syllabus.
It really is. I mean, think about all the different dimensions we touched on today. The ethical arguments for and against intervention, the legal aspects of using force, the geopolitical factors, the cultural and religious motivations of the different groups involved. It's all relevant.
It's like a crash course in international relations, all wrapped up in one conflict. So to bring it back to pacifism, how can our listeners connect what we've discussed today to their exam prep?
Well, for starters, understanding pacifism gives you a framework for analyzing conflicts and evaluating different approaches to peace and security. It's not just about knowing the definition, it's about being able to apply that concept to real-world situations, just like we did with the Afghan War.
So you might get an essay question asking you to, like, evaluate the effectiveness of pacifism in contemporary international relations, or maybe analyze a specific conflict through the lens of pacifist principles.
Exactly. You could even be asked to compare and contrast pacifism with just war theory, highlighting the strengths and weaknesses of each approach. The key is to show that you understand the nuances, the criticisms, the practical implications. You've got to go deep.
Right. It's about demonstrating that you've thought critically about these issues. And don't forget about the historical examples, knowing about key figures and movements associated with pacifism, like Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., that can really add depth to your answers and help you score those extra points.
Absolutely. And remember, the UPSC examiners are looking for well-rounded candidates who can think critically and express themselves clearly. So when you're tackling questions related to peace, conflict, and ethics, drawing on your knowledge of pacifism can really make your answers stand out.
It's like having an extra tool in your belt, right?
Mm.
So for all of you out there prepping for the UPSC, remember that understanding pacifism isn't just about theory. It's about equipping yourself with the knowledge and the analytical skills you'll need to navigate the complexities of the real world.
Well said. And who knows, maybe someday you'll be the ones shaping international policy, drawing on these very principles to build a more peaceful and just world.
That's a great thought to end on. So as always, we encourage you to keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. And if you found this exploration of pacifism helpful, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and give us a like. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a topic that matters. Until then, happy studying and best of luck with your UPSC journey.